Mr. Gregory, he's a doctor to us because he told us all kinds of things that we didn't know about why Al Gore was wrong. We knew that Al Gore was wrong. We didn't know why every which way, though, until Gregory came along. But he is an author and the policy advisor for the Heartland Institute. He has a bachelor's degree in geology from Waynesburg University, a master's in geology from West Virginia University, and what we know him for here being the author of Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. There are so many things to talk about from his 35 years of writing and presenting. I think what we know him most famous for, though, is getting us protesters here at Eagle Council and having to chase them out, which we are eternally grateful to him for making us popular. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over.
Black right there.
Well, there's this gentleman whose name is John. He was a presenter down front. Looks a little suspicious, but we'll keep an eye on him. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over here to Mr. Wrightstone and take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to talk today. If I do it right, you're going to be pretty angry by the end of this on how we're being lied to about climate change, not that it's not actually happening. What I'm going to do here today, we're going to look quickly at some of the basic climate change facts to take a look at some things you might not be aware, and then we'll dive into some of the recent, what I call the big climate lies. Just over the last year, there have been some really, really big lies where they're saying X, and the science, the facts, and the data say Y. And then we'll finish it up. The other big thing I like to talk about are the many benefits of rising temperature and increasing CO2. So first, let's start with what I believe. I'm often called a science denier. So let's say, what do I believe? I believe that CO2 is increasing, and that increase is mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels. It's human-caused emissions. We're in a warming trend. We are. It's been warming in fits and starts, but it started over 300 years ago. We'll take a look at that. I believe that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and that increase in CO2 has a warming effect on the atmosphere. I just think it's fairly modest. And it's overwhelmed by the same natural forces that have been driving temperatures since the dawn of time. And lastly, I believe that Earth and humanity are benefiting greatly from the slight rise in temperature and the increase in CO2. And I think I'll convince you by the end of this presentation today. So let's take a look at some of the facts. We're going to go quickly on this. Usually I delve most of my talk dealing with these, what I call the inconvenient facts. Let's look at carbon dioxide first. Carbon dioxide is at the root of this whole Green New Deal in the Paris Climate Accord, isn't it? Because they're saying they need to demonize carbon dioxide, what otherwise should be a miracle molecule. They're calling it the demon molecule, because they're saying that this increase in CO2 is causing extreme warming of the atmosphere, which will then lead to catastrophic consequences. So this is a chart here. Anything we see in the future, blue will be carbon dioxide. This is a chart, and we'll see this on other charts as we go forward. These are human emissions of CO2. And we can see this goes back to the year 1750. And we can see there were very few CO2 emissions really until the beginning of the 20th century. And it really wasn't until after in that big World War II economic boom, the mid-20th century is whenever we started really seeing a significant amount of carbon dioxide emissions. And it's really that period from the 20th century on. If we were going to find CO2-driven warming, it would be in that last 60 or 70 years we look back. So this is an important chart, and again, we'll be looking at this in further charts as we go forward. Bear in mind that before we started adding CO2 to the atmosphere, I'm going to throw out a few numbers here, not too many, but we were at about 280 parts per million at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We're at a little over 400 now, so we've added, and again, I don't want to throw a whole bunch of numbers out, we've added 130 parts per million. You'll find out why this is so important. 130 part per million increase of CO2. I'm a geologist, and as a geologist, I look at things in the big perspective. I look in thousands of years as a blink of a geologic eye. We look in things in hundreds and thousands and millions of years. So let's take a look first at carbon dioxide through geologic time. And we find that the average, and again, we're a little over 400 parts per million right now. Throughout Earth's history, carbon dioxide has averaged 2,600 parts per million, 6.5 times what they are today. And this is a chart of the last 140 million years of CO2 in the atmosphere. This should scare you to death. This is a chart showing a straight line decline from 2,500 parts per million down to, now that red line is an important line. That's what I call the line of death. That's the minimum threshold for plant life to survive. It's 150 parts per million. At the end of the last ice age, we got to 172 parts per million. We got within a whisker of crossing that line of death. Again, that's the minimum threshold for plant life to survive. If we ever crossed it, that would be a true climate apocalypse. So we're only still a little bit above that line of death. So we're at 400 parts per million. And again, we should look at this. When we look at it in this big perspective, we don't have too much CO2. We don't have enough. We're actually CO2 impoverished, looking at the big picture. And we'll see how some of the benefits of CO2 as we go forward. So that's the big takeaway here. In addition, when the flowering plants, they're called angiosperms when they first appeared on Earth, that was about 130 million years ago at 2,500 parts per million. These plants love high CO2 levels. They don't do well with these low CO2 levels. And that's an important projection. We'll take a little bit better look at that as we go forward. This is temperature. This is the longest thermometer-based temperature record available. It goes back to the year 1659. We can see that the warming actually began in the 17th century. So yes, we're in a warming trend. And you'll often hear, well, this is the warmest year or the warmest decade. Well, yeah, we're in a warming trend. So our recent temperatures should be warmer than the last 50 years or 100 years. I don't dispute that at all. I see it as a benefit coming out of what we're going to look at as the catastrophic cold of what was called the Little Ice Age. The other thing we look at here, I wanted to show this to you. I wanted to update it. I got here and it turned out that the recent temperatures have been increased. This is this is global temperature. So I went back and just for this, I took a look. Well, what are they doing manipulating the data? The blue line here was from 2000. The green line is 2017, and the 2019 version is the red line. And you can see with each, they've been manipulating and adjusting temperature data. This is all from the same data set. They've been moving the old temperature downward and moving the new temperature upward. Because if we just looked at the 2000 version, that's not scary enough. We need a frightened population. We look at the historical climatology network. We see the same thing. The actual data is in blue, and they adjust it. And they adjust it. Part of it's due to what they believe it should be. And again, we see older data, and it's not that it's not warming. It is, but it's not scary enough. They need to adjust it to make it more scary to adjust. And if we look here, this is the same data we just looked at, and I've compared here the changes they've made to the increase in atmospheric CO2. Okay, so they've made these adjustments. This isn't actual temperature. These are adjustments to the temperature. So they're adjusting the temperature measurements to fit what they think the CO2 increase should cause. And again, this is just showing the percentage of adjusted data points. We've now got 61% of the data that we see in this record has been fabricated. It's made up. It's estimated, and it's based on models. So again, I'm not disputing that we've been warming for 100 or more years. I'm just saying it's not as bad as they say it is. And then luckily in 2003, we've got this new network of really good sensors. These are thermometers, 114 across the United States. And it shows that we've just, since that time, since 2003, there's been no warming at all. And this is the United States only, not globally. So let's take a look at some of the big climate lies. You know a lot of the things there, but I like to live in the real world. Rather, what we hear are the climate predictions, speculation of what might happen 30, 50, or 80 years in the future based on climate models. This is a chart here. The blue and green are actual temperatures. The red line is an average 100 climate models. And we find from this is Dr. John Christie data, we find that the climate models over-predict warming 2.5 to 3 times too much. So this is what these are based on, a lot of these predictions. So let's take a look at some of these climate lies that I call them. We're going to take a look here first at forest fires. It was really forest fires that got me into this, because I didn't set out to write a book. I really didn't. I set out to seek the truth. I knew as a geologist that some of what we were being told was just incorrect. I knew that. I suspected other things were. And so the genesis of this book was, I said, you know what? I'm hearing all this contradictory information. I'm going to go back to the base data, and I'm going to find out what's just so. I went back to the base data, and it was really when I got to the fire, that was my, what I call a light bulb moment, or my aha moment. And I said, they're lying to us. They're just flat out lying to us. Because what we see here is the fourth National Climate Assessment, this is a good example, was issued last November, almost a year ago. The front page of it had pictures of California fires. The back page was California fires. And in it, they stated flatly that climate change and global warming were increasing the number of fires and causing great fire hazards. The only chart they had in that fourth National Climate Assessment was this chart. And there was no source provided, which is a sin, a scientific sin. You should always list your source. This is a map of acres burned across the United States. And so what we see here is, I went back and I said, boy, it's contradictory to everything I've got. Well, I found where they got it. This is the chart. They cherry-picked 30 years of data, of the recent data, that shows a slight increase in area burned in the United States. But rather than this, we're at about 20%. There's been a significant and severe decline in the area burned in the United States. If we look at the number of fires, again, we see a significant decline. And we'll talk a little bit about this area burned in the next slide. There's a reason for why there's been a slight increase. We see this is a global study of area burned across the northern hemisphere. We only look at the northern hemisphere for fires because the southern hemisphere, Africa and South America, are mostly, they're man-caused fires. These are intentionally set fires, like we've heard, and we'll talk a little bit about the Amazon coming up here shortly. Those are man-made fires. In the northern hemisphere, these are lightning strikes and other accidental fires. And if we look in California, this is amazing. I tell people this. The number of fires, this is CAL FIRE data, so anything you want to learn about fires in California, you go to CAL FIRE. This is CAL FIRE data. The number of fires in California have declined almost 50% in the last 30 years. The number of fires in California has declined almost 50%. That's incredible. That's the top chart. The bottom chart is area burned, and we see a slight increase. So what's that tell us? It tells us each fire is probably twice as big as it used to be, probably a lot more intense. That's not a climate change issue. That's a forest management issue. We've changed things going back to the Clinton administration. Remember the spotted owl and old growth forests? We've pretty much shut down foresting on the U.S. Forest Service lands. There's a lot that goes into that. The Sierra Conservancy says there are 5 to 6 times too many trees now in the Sierra Nevadas of California. What's that mean? That means there's more fuel. When there is a fire, there's more fuel. The other thing, think about it, the second largest loss of soil moisture after evaporation is the amount of water sucked out of the soil by plants, mostly trees. So now we've got 5 to 6 times too many trees per acre competing for that same scarce soil moisture. So that's just exacerbating any aridity we have. So now we've got too much fuel, we got more arid conditions, and then think about it. They used to be able to get to fires and put them out because there were forest roads. We had lumbering roads. They've grown up. They can't get in anymore. How do you get back into these remote areas? So they have access problems. We've caused problems that have exacerbated fires, but it's not related to climate change. It's not related to global warming. You all heard, I'm sure, we've all heard about the Amazon in flames, right? You couldn't miss it. So this was the big thing. Rainforest is burning at record rates. No, it's not. This was a photograph from NASA. This was probably the most shared photograph of the Amazon showing smoke. This is NASA. It was shared 2 million plus times. What they didn't share was the caption. The caption from NASA stated that the average of the number of fires in 2019 was about average, okay? And then the caption 2 weeks ago when I first looked at it was, it's slightly below average. I think somebody got to NASA and said, hey, you know, we need to create alarm and we need to spread fear, and if you just call it slightly below average, you know, so they bumped it up to average. And yeah, here it is. This is what you go if you go to the NASA site today. This year has been close to average. So this is the NASA data going back to 2001, or 2003 rather. The green line here at the bottom is the 2019 fires. It's right in the middle of the average. Amazon fires happen every year. They're mostly set by man intentionally. There's a fire season they have. We're a little bit higher this year than we've been in recent years, but we're right dead set in the middle of what it's been going back to 2003. It's nothing alarming. We should all be concerned that we want to preserve the rainforest, but most of these are like this. They're burning. These are intentionally set grassland fires. It's a regenerative process that they do every year in preparation for the next crop or the next amount of grassland to come up, that they burn them off. So this is how they do it. What's surprising to me is that they haven't done it before. They've not demonized the Amazon burning. It's been happening, but they haven't. I think they just said, hey, wow, there's this new hobgoblin of alarm that we can use, and they sure did. This was a great example. This was about 3 months ago. The UN came out with a report and claimed that there would be 1 million extinctions of species over the next several decades. Well, to get to 1 million extinctions, you need to have 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions per year happening, okay? So let's see. This is the chart that the UN had. Now, this goes back to the year 1500. What's interesting, if you look here, there are only 5 data points. There's 1 data point per century, and it's cumulative. In other words, one's building on the other. So it looks pretty alarming, doesn't it? And that's pretty scary. I first looked at it, and it took a while to figure it out. So I went back to this is from what's called the IUCN Red List. This is all things, if you want to find out about species that are going extinct or endangered or suspected of being endangered, you go to the Red List. So I went back to that same, this is what they used. I went back to the same Red List. And remember, they did it 1 data point per century. I said, well, let's take a look at it on a decade basis. So I did that. And what we find is that extinctions peaked in the late 1800s. And what it was, this was the period when the Pacific Islands were people were moving, there were rats, there might be cats, and these island populations just got wiped out. They get new species out there, and they just, they'd never seen critters or animals that would eat them or eat their eggs or whatever. And there were a huge number of species because of that, mostly islands, and Australia as well. So let's take a look at this. Let's narrow it down and just look at the last, going back to 1870. And what we see here is that extinctions, remember, the UN said this is a crisis. Extinctions, we're going into they call it the 6th grade extinction, and we need to do something. They've been in significant decline. Right, remember I said 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions is what we'd have to do. You know what it's been for the last 40 years? 2 extinctions per year, not 2,000, not 200, 2. And it's continuing to decrease. So they're lying to you. They're lying to us about this. They lied to us about fires. It's categorically, and we can prove it. And there's not going to be another great extinction. We're doing a pretty darn good job preserving endangered species, and we should all be proud of it. And what they're doing is sowing fear and alarm, and they need to. So in this report, they said that the greatest threat to species was loss of habitat. Okay, that's our fear. We have to stop this. Loss of habitat's the problem. What's their solution for solving climate change? What is it? Renewables, which is right here. Look at this. That's what they want. They want to pave over vast stretches of America for solar panel farms. They want the top left. They want this covering America. They want this to be their solution. Loss of habitat's the greatest threat to species, and they're just going to make it worse. And they don't see the irony in this. I'm from Pennsylvania, and we have the Pennsylvania Game Commission that controls about 1.5 million acres. Last year, the Pennsylvania Game Commission voted unanimously, 8-0, to forbid and ban any wind projects on their property, to their credit. And they did it because they said it was dangerous. It impacted endangered species, among other things. And they said we just don't want it. These people, the commissioners, were just very adamant. The other thing, just recently the UN issued a report on the food supply and predicted huge amounts of famine. What we do is we see that actually, when we actually look at the data, my goodness, there's more and more food and crops being grown every year. The food production in the United States and worldwide is greatly outpacing any increase in population growth. These are grain production. We can see it's marching lockstep in rising temperature and increasing CO2. Think about rising temperatures. What's that mean if you're growing crops? Longer growing seasons. You're killing frosts, stop earlier in the spring, arrive later in the fall. You get more plantings in. We're actually increasing areas that are tillable and arable. We've not really benefited from that because tree line's moving forward. We're moving up mountains. I guess to borrow a phrase from Jimmy Buffett, it would be changes in altitudes, changes in latitudes. But so both the altitude and the latitudes. Here's corn production. Continue to rise. The blue, of course, is CO2 emissions. And again, I referenced a study here. This is Dr. Craig Idso that did laboratory experiments. He increased 300 parts per million. What would that do to the crops that we eat? He found that it would increase crop growth by 46%. 46% increase. And that's a good thing. That's a really, really good thing. We can benefit and help the earth. I'm a contributing writer for the Cornwall Alliance, which is a Christian group, and we believe that we should use all of our resources, or they'll say all of God's creation, for the betterment of mankind, and do it as good stewards. But you'd be surprised how many people are opposed to that. And I want to go through, we're just closing up here. I'm going to go through a few slides to show you just how different it is, what's actually happening compared to what we're being told. This is drought. We're being told that droughts are increasing. They're not. They're in decline. And particularly the most significant droughts of the 20th century. The bulk of those occurred before 1960. We've had a big, big decline in droughts. And again, it probably goes back to that increase in soil moisture we talked about. The other big thing I like to talk about too is when we look in human history, is the strong relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. Before climate science became politicized, these warm periods we saw before were called climate optima. And they were called climate optima because the Earth and its ecosystems benefited along with humanity. We saw during the warm periods, we had bountiful harvests, we could feed the population. It's the cold periods that are horrific. When the cold periods came, with names like the Dark Ages, the Greek Dark Ages and the Little Ice Age, we had crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation consistently. And that's just opposite of what we're being told. We're being told, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, we can't get more than 1.5 degrees warming. Well, yeah, we can. So I'm going to end up with this. The earth is thriving and prospering. Sleep well tonight. You're not destroying the planet. We're getting better. And this is from NASA, showing the greening of the earth. According to NASA, up to 50% of the earth is greening. In other words, vegetation's increasing. Less than 4% is what they call browning, or decrease of vegetation. So again, you can go to NASA and find that. We're also told that the heat is going to kill a lot of people. This is the largest study of its kind, 74 million people. Study around the world showed that cold-related deaths killed 20 times as many people as heat. Completely opposite of what we're being told. Extreme weather deaths are increasing, aren't they? No. They're a significant decline. They've declined by 98% in the last 80 years. And if we compare CO2 use to prosperity, we're comparing CO2 emissions per capita to the GDP per capita. It's a pretty good estimate of prosperity. We just see there's a strong, strong correlation between the two. Of the more CO2 emissions, the more prosperous your people are. And again, this is a comparison of life expectancy going back to 1820 versus the annual use of fossil fuels. So Earth and humanity are thriving and prospering, and it's partly because of increasing CO2 and rising temperatures, and they're lying to you about it. Thank you.